to Noah. I'll upload it to YouTube. So there will be a link, for this to watch again in case you do drink all the whiskey tonight and forget everything. But so I am recording this. But just to give you a little background, my name's Charles Grabitsky. I am from San Francisco, born and raised in the city. Went to a rival grammar school from Noah. We played basketball against each other, I think once or twice, but we ended up at the same high school and kind of knew each other in high school a little bit, but really got to know each other after high school, in college, and just living in the city. And actually we lived in Mexico together for a while. So we've really known each other for a long time now. But we did a tasting with him and his family and some other friends a couple of months ago. And the idea popped up to do a tasting for Thornhill, a fundraiser. And I thought that would be a great idea. I do tastings all over the place. Since COVID, everything's been online. But before then, I was doing in-person tastings all over New York State. I run a gastronomic tourism company called Rascal and Thorn, and I take people on whiskey tours all around the world. So I take people to Scotland, Ireland, Japan, Kentucky. We even go to some other places in the States that are distilling now. But I've been doing that since 2014. And everything stopped in its tracks last March. I just got back from Japan and Mexico. We did a mezcal trip to Oaxaca, got back from both of those trips, and the world shut down. So I haven't been doing that since then. I plan to get back into that in the fall with Kentucky and possibly Oaxaca again. But I do that. I run a very large whiskey club here in New York called the Saratoga Whiskey Club. We have over 100 members now. We do 2-3 tastings a month. It's really kind of intense whiskey experiences, a lot of hard to get bottles and stuff like that. And on top of that, I'm opening a whiskey shop here in town. I'm still waiting on my liquor license. It's been almost 5 months now that we've been waiting on the liquor license, but so all of my world is whiskey focused. So know Noah from high school since then, and I've gotten into whiskey pretty much this last decade, and it's become a big part of my life. But tonight we're going to have a really fun night. We're going to go around the world. This is similar to the tasting I did with Noah before, where we are going to start in the US. We're going to skip over to Canada real quick, then over to Ireland, and then we're going to end up in Scotland. But we have a lot of ground to cover. We have a lot of whiskey to cover. I don't want to get too far behind. I'm going to try and keep this within the 2-hour time frame if possible. I don't have to go anywhere, however, so if people do want to stay on and ask questions or just whatever, that's fine. There's no rush from that standpoint, but I do want to try and get through as much as I can in 2 hours, so that if people need to go, that's fine. But so I'm going to get started. We're going to work with America first. We're going to actually, I have a slide that I'm going to kind of show you. But before we even do that, let's pour this first whiskey. This is a bourbon. This is from Kentucky. It's called Early Times. It's a really interesting whiskey, and I think it's a really nice way to kind of start a tasting. It's very kind of light. It's not something that's going to overpower the palate. We're going to get into some of the rules of bourbon and what makes bourbon bourbon here in a second. And once we do that, I'll go over some of the notes of this bourbon. But I thought, before we even start, let's just raise a glass, just a toast to all you coming tonight on Saturday, and to Thornhill, and to learning about whiskey tonight. But welcome everybody. I'm glad you all could join us tonight. So cheers. But I'm gonna pull up a slide and we're gonna talk bourbon real quick. See if I can see that. You guys see anything right now?
Yes.
You see the bourbon slide?
Bourbon
You see
facts.
bourbon facts not in presentation mode, then edit.
Yeah. Okay, good. Just not pulling up on my screen. Give me 1 second here. There we go. Okay. All right, there you go. You all see that, right?
Yes.
Okay. So we're going to talk a little about bourbon facts. I'm going to walk through this. This is really pretty interesting. A lot of people think bourbon has to come from Kentucky to be called bourbon. That's a myth. However, it is the birthplace of bourbon. The majority, in fact, almost 95% of the world's supply comes out of Kentucky. So Kentucky is definitely where everything comes from. However, it doesn't have to come from Kentucky in order to be called bourbon. There are actually probably about 75 distilleries now in Kentucky as of today. And it is America's only native spirit. So back in 1964, Congress actually had an act where they declared bourbon to be America's native spirit. It's a big deal. There's nothing else at this point that's been, passed by Congress, making it a native spirit. It's a huge industry, obviously, and lots of barrels, 1.7 million barrels. There's a lot more barrels than there are people in Kentucky. I'm not going to go through the history. It's going to take too long, but it goes way back. These are some of the names of some of the important families. You have the Evan Williams, you have Elijah Craig, you have the Beams. We can get into real detail on this, but it will take way too long. Since we're doing an around the world tasting, I don't want to take too long on just the bourbon. There are some really important things, though, to look at as we get later on in the 20th century. Prohibition was a very big deal, obviously. A lot of distilleries in the US went out of business during Prohibition. In Kentucky, there were only 10 distilleries. All of the distilleries actually in the US, there were only 10, and they were all in Kentucky, that were granted medicinal licenses during Prohibition. So those 10 distilleries didn't have to close during Prohibition. They could continue to make whiskey. However, it was supposed to be used for medicinal purposes. But from what I heard, it wasn't too hard to get a script from your doc if you had a backache and you needed some whiskey to help out. Again, 1964, you have granted by Congress, America's native spirit. And then the bourbon industry really crashed in the 70s. Clear spirits, gin, vodka, coolers, you had your Bartles and James, you had all these things that really blew bourbon away in terms of volume. And bourbon, in a way, was looked at kind of as an old-fashioned kind of outdated drink. And it wasn't really until the early 2000s when bourbon kind of became popular again. So it really, it went through a lot of phases. Obviously, Prohibition was a big one, but also clear spirits, vodka and gin were really, really big. And there is even a National Bourbon Heritage Month now. But here are some of the rules. Produced in the US, and it has to be made from a minimum of 51% corn. Corn is what makes bourbon sweet. Corn is that grain that has that sweetness. So it could be 51% corn and could be a combination of other grains, but as long as it's 51% corn, you can call it bourbon. The other grains that are used are rye, wheat, malted barley. There's even some other grains that they're using now, some oats, and other things as well. And then distilled at no higher than 160 proof, always aged in a new barrel. This is a really important fact. In Kentucky and all over the US, if you're making bourbon, it can't be in a used barrel. It can't be in a barrel that already had spirit in it that was aging. So that keeps the cooperages in business, that keeps the lumberjacks in business, it keeps the forests repopulating trees. And then all of those barrels end up going across the pond to different countries to be used to make Irish whiskey or Scotch whiskey or other whiskeys in other countries as well. It's one way that they continue to keep these barrels in circulation with this rule that it has to be in a new barrel each time for it to be called bourbon. And then it has to be at least 80 proof or 40 ABV. This bottle that we're tasting right now is 100 proof. So this is 50 ABV. So this is a little strong, but it's, you know, it's got a lot of lighter notes to it. So, and it's a really kind of nice way to get the palate going. But things that make bourbon unique: new barrels, all natural, no coloring. It's really important. You can't add any kind of coloring or flavors in order for it to be called bourbon. In Scotland, you can add some coloring and you can still call it Scotch, but with bourbon, you can't do that. There's different types of warehouses. They're called rick houses here in the US. They're really tall. There's different temperatures fluctuations throughout these warehouses. We already talked about the recipe. And then these last two. So there's two types of bourbon that you're going to kind of see. There's a straight bourbon that's aged for at least 2 years, or there's this bottled in bond. And what we're having right now is actually a bottled in bond bourbon. And I like to use a bottled in bond bourbon because it has a little bit of history to it. And I just want to explain that real quick. So back in the early 20th century, around 1900 or so, they were making a lot of whiskey. This is pre-prohibition. And they were doing it in all types of stills. They were doing it with all types of corn and different grains. And they were really kind of moonshiners slash, you know, early whiskey makers. They really didn't have a process that was too wonderful. And what was happening was there was a lot of kind of bad stuff going on. There was a lot of things that were being added to the whiskey to give it extra flavor or extra oomph or whatever. And some of these things were really bad. Some of these were actually poisonous. And there were people who died because they were drinking whiskey at the time that was basically poisonous. They were making whiskey and they weren't doing it in the way that was safe. And so they actually passed a law. It's the Bottled in Bond Act. And it basically created some rules. And these rules were basically to protect the consumer from having these sicknesses. And the Bottled in Bond Act basically said it had to be distilled in one season from one distillery and then aged in a federally bonded warehouse for at least 4 years and bottled at 100 proof. So we're drinking actually right now a bottled in bond whiskey. So we know for a fact, whenever you see bottled in bond on a bottle, that it's going to be at least 4 years old. And you're going to know the proof. It's always going to be this 50 ABV or 100 proof. And we also know that it's going to be safe and we can drink it. Whereas back in the day, that was something to worry about. Now you don't really need to worry about it, but they still use this term, bottled in bond, and that's where it comes from. It comes from this period of time when things were pretty scary and you didn't know what you were drinking. So I'm going to
So
stop.
Charles, with
Yeah.
its the federally bonded warehouse, does that mean that there's like a federal agent that visits regularly and checks in on what they're doing, or?
Yeah, so they have to have, you know, obviously a bond that they're granted. So it's not only you know, it's something you have to apply for and it has to be certified, and they do have people that do come and check. Nowadays they don't really do that. I mean, it's basically, that's an old school kind of thing. You know, they still do make sure it's at least 4 years and 100 proof, and they are federally bonded, but they're not people coming all the time. There's so much whiskey now that are under these warehouses, and most of these companies that are doing bottled in bond are really large, you know, distilleries to begin with. So it's not as regulated as it used to be, but they do probably still check once a year or something like that. But this one we're drinking right now is 79% corn. So again, remember I said 51% to be bourbon. This one's 79% corn, so quite a high corn content. The rye is the secondary grain, so that would be the next highest percentage grain. It's 11% rye. So there's a tiny bit of that rye spice in it, not much, just a little bit. And then it's 10% malted barley. So those are the three ingredients that are in this early times bottled and bond bourbon. One of the things that's interesting about early times, it is the longest continually operated distillery under the same ownership in Kentucky. So they've been around a long, long, long time. That's another reason why I like to start with them. They have a lot of history, and we kind of went through some of that history. Actually, the label itself, the early times label, has been in existence for 160 years. So that's pretty amazing, you know, to think about that there were bottles back in the day with early times written on them, and we still see that today. You know, there's some other whiskeys out there that are old as well, but this one stands out, and I think it has a for the price. This is a value whiskey. This is something that you can find locally, and it's, I think, for what it is, I think it's a really good kind of intro bourbon whiskey. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to try and do this as quick as I can, but there's a video. I'm going to play one video for you guys this whole night. This is it. It's just 9 minutes, which is 9 minutes of time, which is a lot, but it goes through how they make bourbon. And it not only teaches you the bourbon side, but it will also translate when we go to these other countries, and you can I can then at least explain, remember that when they were making the bourbon, this is how it's different when we're making Irish whiskey or when we're doing Scotch whiskey. So I'm going to play this video for you. It is 9 minutes. I'm going to blow up the screen. It is going to be closed captioned as well, just so you can understand them. That most of these people are, you know, have pretty strong Kentucky accents too. So it does help to have the closed captioning on there too. So I'm going to share this right now.
Distillery starts out with hygiene and quality. How they prepare the grains, their yeast strains, that's the science. And then after that, how you mature it, how you bottle it, how you filter it, you can multi-brand. Literally, when we go around, we're going to let you see the guys who really make it. I hope your audience speaks Kentuckese. The products and the process for making the whiskey is the same way it was in the 17 and 1800s. It's grain, water, yeast beer that you distill and put into a barrel. The only thing you can do is filter it and add water. So, you know, there's a strict set of limitations that you have to adhere to. So really the only thing that's changed around here are some of the techniques and some of the technologies, but the process is still the same. Bourbon is a product of the United States, made anywhere in the U.S. We have 5 important things that we need to follow to be able to call it bourbon. First thing, has to be made from at least 51% corn, aged in a new charred oak container. Can't be distilled any higher than 160 proof. Can't go into that container any higher than 125 proof, and we can't add any colorings or flavoring. Now, one of the reasons we make so much bourbon here in Kentucky is because of our water. This part of the state is on a limestone bed, and our water filters through that limestone. This does 2 main things. First thing, that water is picking up calcium, which gives us a nice sweet flavor, but also that limestone removes iron. Iron is terrible for making whiskey. It makes a really bitter, off-tasting whiskey. So you have to start with a quality water source if you're going to have a quality bourbon.
When grain trucks come in here, we probe that grain truck 4 times. We probe it twice in the back, twice in the front. And I'm looking for mold, bacteria, cause, whatever in it. That is very important because if you bring mold on anything around you, bourbon.
At the very top where those pipes are coming in, that's where we take the corn and clean it, because this will give you bad bourbon. So the grain cleaner is going to clean out everything that we don't want that's coming off that truck.
Once it's been inspected, it'll get offloaded into the bins outside. We use a hammer mill to crush the grain into a mill. You know, corn, the starch is all inside the kernel. So you have to break the kernel to get to the starch, which is what we're after. We're then going to mix that with our limestone water in our cooker.
So what we just heard was the start of a cook. We are boiling our limestone water. We'll start with corn, then with rye, and then with malted barley in sequence. And that will give us our mash.
All right, folks. We talk about fermentation next. Now, yeast is going to be the main actor in fermentation. Now, we have these starchy grains. We get the sugars out of those through the mashing process. Yeast is going to consume those sugars, produce heat, CO2, and alcohol.
These two fermenters give you just one of the best descriptions of what happens. This is brand new. So it's brand new, filled up. There's no fermentation going in this one. It's where the yeast is saying, well, did you feed me well or not? Look at here. This is when the yeast says, thank you. Taste this. Is that about the best sourdough bread you've ever had? This one has been here for 3 days. So if you feel on here, there's a grain cap, and that sort of locks in things. But if you break through the grain cap and taste the beer, that's the finished product.
From the fermenter, we're going to move into the source of flavor, is how we distill.
So after 3 days in those fermenters, we're going to bring the beer over to this column. Inside, there are perforated plates. That beer is going to be piped into the top, and it's going to drip down, wash down over those plates.
Put your hand on top of that. Now, if that hand, if you imagine, was a scouring pad made of copper, we boil it the second time and it has to go through your hand or that copper. It will pick up a lot of impurities.
Alcohol, of course, has a lower boiling point. So if we get that temperature just right, that alcohol, it's going to vaporize, rise to the top, while that spent mash and water continues down. Now the alcohol vapor rising off the top, we're going to collect it, condense it. It'll end up in the first tail box. At this point, we call it low wine.
And you notice how grungy it is. That is the copper sulfate from the malt and corn oil.
We'll pull a little sample off here. That's what it smells like when it first comes off the still. It's quite different than what we collect and what we put in the barrel. So we're going to take that low wine. We're going to send it over to our second still. It is a pot still, what we call a doubler. We're going to gently redistill that low wine. Strip away some more impurities, a bit of water, collect those good alcohol vapors, condense them once more. They're going to wind up in the second tail box, this time as high wine.
So the spirit ends up in the gauge tank. There we will add limestone water that at this point has been filtered. Every bourbon distillery distills over 125 proof. Every bourbon distillery adds water to its spirit going into the barrel. And the most expensive component of the bourbon is the barrel.
Average cost of a newly charged white oak barrel in today's environment is about $150 a barrel. This year alone, we're going through 100,000 barrels. And it will be 3 to 23 years before you can even resell the barrel to do anything else with it. So imagine the investment that they have in the future when they're doing this every year for the next 20 years.
As that clear whiskey is sitting in the barrel, in the warehouse, exposed to seasonal changes, it's going to be breathing, expanding and contracting in and out of the wood.
Because Mother Nature has a lot to do with the movement of the whiskey in and out of the wood, and it's not temperature, it's barometric pressure. When the whiskey warms up inside the barrel, the molecules expand, just like a 2-liter soda bottle when it gets hot. The pressure is so great inside that barrel, it pushes the whiskey out into the grain of the wood through the char. And when it does that, because the water molecules are smaller than the alcohol molecules, it actually pushes some of the water out through the grain of the wood.
Meaning our volume drops. And as we heat and cool, the barrel is also pulling in the air of the warehouse.
So what's actually going on inside the barrel is the alcohol molecules are trapped in the wood, and it breaks down the saps and rosin. And so when the whiskey travels back the other way, when it cools down or when the pressure changes, it pulls those flavors from the sap and the rosin and the color from the char back into the heart of the barrel. I tell people to think of the barrel like a tea bag. All right. So you use that barrel one time for bourbon. You try to use it again to make the same product, just like a cup of tea. The color and the taste is not the same. It's going to be diluted.
After 6 or 7 years, will have lost 50% of its original contents.
And the longer you leave it after that, the less you're going to have. Sometimes you open up the barrels are empty. Heartbreak City.
But what's left is a very rich, flavorful product. There's not a single barrel in here that tastes like another barrel.
This barrel was filled the same time this one was, and they're put right next to each other, and they taste completely different.
These quadrants are set up, and depending upon where I place the barrel in this warehouse, and on which side of the warehouse, and on which level, I can extract different chemical flavors from the white oak itself.
We batch 130 barrels together to make a consistent flavor profile.
And you're taking things that are overstated and things that are understated, and you can balance them and make them better together. That's why we do it. And I don't care what distillery you go to, everybody has to do it that way, especially for a uniform profile.
Isn't life a journey?
All right, that's the only video for tonight. I just wanted to get that out there. I think it's a really good one. I mean, 9 minutes, obviously, it's a lot to take in. However, at least you can see the people, you can see kind of the process, how it works.
I want that word.
Oops.
So here we have the punishment book.
Yeah.
Something's here playing in the background. There we go. But it's really nice. I think it's a good kind of overview of how bourbon is made, and went over some of the rules again of what I kind of already described. This second whiskey that we're doing, I thought would be a really fun one because one, it's really, really delicious. But secondly, just like they said at the end of this video, no two barrels are the same. You know, this one has a very similar, what they would call recipe or mash bill from the first one we had. So remember, the first one was 79% corn. This one's 72% corn, so it's not too far off. It's 18% rye, so there's a tiny bit more rye in this one, and then it's the same 10% malted barley. But I thought it was fun because, you know, the recipe is pretty similar, but they taste very different. I mean, if you have a tiny bit of the first one left and want to do a side-by-side, you can. This one's a little higher proof. This is 115 proof, but the recipe is pretty much the same. Now, this is going to be probably a little older. There's no age statement on this bottle. This is called the Old Forester 1920, and it is basically a bottle that they're calling Prohibition style. So that's why it's called 1920. Because again, like I said, during Prohibition, there were so many, just only a few distilleries that were granted medicinal licenses during that time. This distillery happened to be one of them, which is the Brown-Forman group that's behind Old Forester and Early Times. So this one has a very different palate. It's bolder, it's richer. It's a really, really fantastic bourbon. They have this series. They have the 1897, which is the Bottled in Bond Act, and then they have this 1920 version. This one is by far the best, I think, of the three. And you can find this one too out in stores. But this is a really delicious one at 115 proof. This is the blue bottle of Early Times in the chat room, the question. This one here. That's the first whiskey we did. And then this is the second one. Have any of you been to Kentucky? Anybody? Visited distilleries? No? It's a lot of fun. A lot of great distilleries. You know, there's so many different areas in Kentucky where there are concentrations of distilleries. Old Forester's in Louisville. I was actually just down in Louisville in January picking up a barrel. I was in and out. I didn't see anybody. Drove 12 hours. We had a trailer attached to the car. literally went to the distillery, put the whole barrel and all 250 bottles in the back of the trailer, and turned around and went back to New York. Didn't want to catch anything down there. They were going through a spike in cases at the time, and it was already sketchy enough to get in the car and drive down there. Felt like I was in The Walking Dead a little bit, but made it. But it's a lot of fun. Kentucky's got a lot going on. I do a couple of trips a year, usually to Kentucky with people. We do like a 4-night, and so it's a lot of fun. A lot of good whiskey to try. What do you guys think of this one? You like it? Yeah. So in the US, we also make rye whiskey. We also make single malt American whiskey. And then we do just some basic American whiskey. So there are, some interesting facts behind all of these. So rye, similar to bourbon, has to be at least 51%, but it's rye. So it's not going to be the corn, it's got to be rye. So in order to be called a rye, you have to have that 51% of that grain. And then the rest can be whatever. However, usually with rye, you're going to have a high percentage of rye. And we even have some 100% rye whiskeys here in the US, and some of them are very, very good. And then we also make single malt American whiskey now here in the US, and it's becoming kind of a new category that's really taking off. It's basically imitating whiskey that's made in Scotland, but they're making it here in the US. So it's barley, which would be the main ingredient, and it would be 100% malted barley is what they would be using if they were making single malt here in the US. So it'd be the same technique, same style of process, and we'll talk about Scotland later, but they're doing that now here in the US. And that category of whiskey is really starting to take off. There's some great West Coast distilleries as well up in Seattle. There's Westland. Westland's fantastic. I'm actually going there in July. I know them pretty well. They were pretty much the founders of American single malt. Hoffman, the distiller there, is a phenomenal person. So they really know what they're doing. But now there's a lot all over the country. We have some here in New York State as well that are making some pretty good single malt. Hill Rock. I don't know if any of you heard of Hill Rock, but they're doing some good stuff out here. So that's all being done here. However, rye, which will be our next whiskey, whiskey number 3, is a thing that's really made a lot in Canada. Rye is typically a northern country, so think Northern Europe, think northern, North America, so the upper parts of the US and Canada. The cooler climates are more, rye country. So Germany and some of the northern countries in Europe, they make a lot of rye. Think of the rye breads and some of the other things that are made using rye. Well, Canada really is a rye whiskey country, and Canada's been making whiskey for a long, long time as well. They go way back to the 1700s. But the term rye whiskey in Canada is also Canadian whiskey. So sometimes when people just say Canadian whiskey, what they're really saying is rye whiskey, because that's pretty much what they make. Now they do make some whiskeys that are, more than 51% corn, but they can't call it bourbon because, again, it's not made in the United States. That's a really important rule. However, they do have some recipes that are similar to bourbons, but they would have to call that Canadian whiskey. They couldn't call that bourbon. But what we're doing next is lot 40. And this is one that you should be able to find locally. And I like kind of picking out whiskeys that you can actually get your hands on too.
You have the bottle also. I like seeing the bottles.
Yeah, I'll lift that one up here. It's actually a pretty cool looking bottle. It's tall and thin.
Yeah, that is cool.
So it's
kind of sleek.
They have They actually have a cast strength version of this that they only sell in Canada. I wish they sold it down here. I did taste it. It's really phenomenal, but they do have a cast strength, which is a lot higher proof. This one's 86% proof, or 86 proof, 43% ABV. So we're dropping. We just had 115 proof bourbon. So this is going to taste lighter, okay? But I thought, you know, we can't just keep going up in proof or we're going to just never make it to the end. We have to kind of, you know, take a little switch and dive back down to reality. Again, whiskey has to be at least 40% ABV. So this is 43. You know, we're a little bit above the minimum, but we got to bring our palate back a little too. That 1920 is fantastic, Old Forester, but we are learning about whiskey tonight and not trying to forget about whiskey tonight. So lot 40, this is 100% rye, okay? So we just talked about rye having to be at least 51% and that some are 100%. Well, this one is 100% rye. This is unmalted rye. So they didn't actually malt this rye. Malted rye is something that we're starting to see here in the United States. And there are some distilleries that are doing some good malted rye stuff, but most is unmalted, which means they're taking the raw ingredient. When we talk about Ireland and Scotland, we'll talk a little bit more about what malting is, but just so you know, this is really raw rye grain that's being cooked and used to distill. This one is also, there's no age on the bottle, but we know it's at least 3 years because whiskey in Canada needs to be at least 3 years in order to be called whiskey. But most people think that this is between 7 and 8 years, this rye whiskey. It's from Ontario. It's from the Hiram Walker distillery. Now, this distillery has been around a long, long, long time. Back in the 1800s, early 1800s. And it's pretty interesting. They're right across the water from Detroit. And during Prohibition, the Hiram Walker distillery was famous for rum running or bringing whiskey into the US illegally. So I like this distillery. They're a big distillery. They make a lot of different products, but I think they do a good job. I really like this rye. So we're going to get some kind of bread notes on this. I think you're definitely going to get like this maltiness kind of bread note on this and the spice from the rye. And if you guys have any notes you want to share, please chime in. It's all about what you guys are getting out of these whiskeys as we go through them as well. It doesn't have that corn sweetness, you know, with the first two, you know, what corn brings is like vanilla, caramel, you know, some of that comes from the oak too, because we're using a charred oak barrel, but the corn really brings out, you know, some of these kind of richer, sweeter notes, you know, the caramel notes, even some chocolate notes. This one doesn't have that. This one's more kind of has this lighter spice. It's almost like a baking spice, maybe like a Christmassy spice. It's light, it's 43%, so it's not too powering, but it definitely doesn't have that sweetness. It's a little more grassy, kind of earthy.
I like the Old Forester one had like a caramel or like a butterscotch smell that I like.
Yeah. So speaking of smell, or the nose is what they basically would call that.
The nose.
So just to go, I'm picking up the Old Forester again. Some techniques on nosing or smelling your whiskey. One, don't stick your nose right in the glass, like right in the glass, or you'll burn your nose hairs if you have nose hairs, or you'll just burn your brain. You want to keep your mouth open when you nose. Most people don't know about that. I mean, I guess, you know, if you guys have been up to the wine country and done some wine tastings, they'll probably tell you that too. But when you're nosing a whiskey, you want to keep your nose above the glass. So not in the glass, above the glass. Keep your mouth open and breathe through both your nose and your mouth. You want some of that air coming through your mouth. You know, you're all connected. That's all connected back there. But having that extra air come through your mouth brings more kind of notes in. It's not just the alcohol that you're getting, you know, especially on these higher proof whiskeys. So definitely keep your mouth, it doesn't have to be wide open, just slightly open. Bring some air in with your nose and your mouth. You know, and then when you have the whiskey in your mouth, you know, everybody has a different way to do it. I like to keep it in my mouth for a little bit. I don't swish it, or maybe I'll let it dance around the tongue a little bit, and you know, let it go back on the sides a little bit, but I'm not going to swish it like a wine. And then, you know, let it go back and swallow it, and you'll get that finish. So that, you know, you have the nose, the palate, and the finish. Those are the three parts of the whiskey experience. And there's a great rule when you're drinking whiskey. And I love this rule. And somebody told me this many years ago, and I love using it because I think it really works. It's basically the 3-sip rule. The first sip of any whiskey, whether you've had it or not, especially if you haven't had it, but regardless, is the first sip, forget about it. Whether you like the first sip or you don't, it shouldn't be the reason why you say yes or no to that whiskey, okay? Your mouth is getting adjusted to the alcohol. It's getting adjusted to that flavor component. You know, it could be a high proof something, and it could be smoky, it could be whatever. Your mouth is getting used to that. So the first sip, forget about it. Don't use that as your gauge of whether it's something you like or not. The second sip should be better than the first, okay? So you should like it more than the first sip. If the third sip is even more, then it's a whiskey you for sure are gonna like. So if it gets worse over time, if the second sip is worse than the first and the third is even worse than the second, then it's not for you. And that's fine too. Everybody has different palates. Not every whiskey is for everybody. Everybody drinks their whiskey differently as well. There's no reason you have to like something that your neighbor likes because they say it's the best thing. Everybody's different. And I run this big club out here. You know, I have people all the time that say, "Oh, I hate Scotch. Scotch is horrible." I'm like, "Well, why? You know, why do you think that?" And it's usually because they've had an experience where they tasted something and maybe it was smoky or maybe it was just bad, and that was enough. They think everything is going to be like that, and that's not the case. But it's the same for all whiskeys. So let it gradually grow on you or not grow on you, and then you can decide whether or not you want to keep drinking it. But that's really how you should approach a whiskey is not the first sip, especially if it's your first whiskey of the night. Your mouth and palate has to get used to all of that. It's quite a thing. Yeah. Any questions or comments on these first 3 whiskeys? I know I gotta step it up here. We got still 5 more to go. Anybody have any likes, dislikes? Do you like the Lot 40? I'm curious.
It's nice. It's definitely.
I see somebody going, it's okay.
Mary liked Lot 40.
All right.
Of course, I also like the little Forester.
Yeah. Yep.
I could tell it was lighter after the second one.
What is that?
Well, I think what it's nice is it's a decent transition into Ireland, which is where we're going next. And this next one actually is 40%. So I didn't want to go, you know, all over the place in terms of ABV. I wanted to bring us back kind of down to earth after these first 2 bourbons. But we are going to go to Ireland now. I do have a slide on Ireland. I want to share some information. It's not a lot, but it's worth looking at. So let me pull that up here on my screen. Now, have many of you been to Ireland? I'm sure more have been to Ireland than Kentucky. Yes, yes, a couple. All right. All right, so I bring groups to Ireland a lot. I like Ireland. I love Ireland. It's a really beautiful place. Ireland was huge in whiskey making. They were the leaders in the world for a long time. And one of the big behemoth distilleries was Middleton. Middleton has been in Ireland for a very long time. They make Jameson. We've all heard of Jameson. So Middleton is in Cork, which is in kind of south central Ireland. But they make a lot of different expressions. They make Redbreast, they make Powers, they make Jameson, and they make what we're going to be drinking next, which is Green Spot. They do all the spots. So there's Green Spot, Yellow Spot, Red Spot. They have a new one now, Blue Spot, which is really phenomenal as well. So there's all these different spots, and I'll explain what that is here once we start talking about Green Spot. But just quickly go through Ireland and what makes Ireland unique. So this is Kilbeggan. Kilbeggan is also one of the oldest distilleries in Ireland. Them and Bushmills have this kind of competition about who is older. You know, Bushmills is in Northern Ireland, so Bushmills can say they're the oldest, but the Irish in the Republic of Ireland, they don't want to grant Northern Ireland any kudos, so they say Kilbeggan is the oldest. So they go back and forth over that. But this is at the Kilbeggan distillery. These are the old pot stills. These are the old stills that they used to use. They now have this really beautiful museum there. But the still on the left is really interesting. This one here, this tall cylindrical still. It's called a coffee still. And it's an important part of Irish history. And it's something I think I should explain a little bit because it kind of works in both the Irish history and the Scotch history. So there was a guy back in the 19th century. His last name was Coffey. And he was the inventor of this still. And it's a continuous column still. So I don't know if you remember in the video that we watched with the bourbon, we saw some of these really tall column stills. Those were also these continuous stills that had these plates. Remember, he was talking about how it was going through the hand and the impurities. Well, this is a similar kind of still. Basically, this is used for grain. So like corn or wheat or rye. And it's a still that operates 24 hours a day. It's always working. It's continuous. And it was a really clever invention that he made. And he approached some of the major Irish distilleries back then and said, hey, I have this great still. It'll make you do production. Now, when you're looking at these big pot stills here, these run once and then you have to clean them out. It's a lot of work. You've got to go inside them and scrub them and do all this stuff. So if you have a still like this that's running 24 hours a day, you don't need to worry about that. It's just constantly pumping out this grain whiskey. So he went to these distillers and said, hey, look, I have this. Do you want to use it? They kind of rubbed their noses and stuck them up in the air and said, no, we want to stick to our traditional pot stills. We are not interested. And so what did he do? He went to Scotland. He said, hey, look, I have this incredible invention, this new still. It runs 24 hours a day. The Scots looked at it and they're like, oh, this is great. And they took it and they started making their own grain whiskey with this still. And that was one of the main reasons why Scotland overtook the Irish in making whiskey back in the late 19th, early 20th century. There were other reasons too, but this still was one of them. And it's kind of funny because the Irish had a chance. They had their opportunity to actually embrace this still and use it and make this blended whiskey, which the Scotch ended up doing and overtaking the Irish for that reason. Not alone, but it was a big part of it. So it's kind of interesting. The term whiskey, go back one slide. Uisce Beatha. This is the old Gaelic word for water of life. And if you say this first word, this whiskey, really quickly and incorrectly, you get the word whiskey. Okay, so this is where the actual word whiskey comes from. It comes from the old Gaelic term for water of life. This goes way back. You know, in Ireland, the monks were making whiskey back in the 15th century. And they were calling it this, the Whiskey Beata, they were calling it the water of life. Now they weren't aging it in barrels. It wasn't like they were doing it in the 19th or 20th century, but they were distilling grain back then and calling it the water of life. And eventually that's where our whiskey comes from. Prohibition not only hurt the US in terms of bourbon and rye, but it really hurt the Irish as well. The Irish counted on the American population buying Irish whiskey, and Prohibition stopped that. So you had a lot of different reasons. You had in the late 19th century, you had the potato famine, then you had the coffee still, craziness with them not wanting to use that. And then you had Prohibition. Then you also had the wars. You had all these things that made Ireland go from the top of the world to really nothing. I mean, they were really low on the ladder for a long time. And they only had 2 distilleries for many, many, many decades since the early 20th century. And they were the 2 largest. So you had Middleton and you had Cooley and Bushmills. Those were like the 3 kind of powerhouses of the time, Cooley and Bushmills. But what they do in Ireland that's different than Scotland is they actually use 3 stills. So when we go to Ireland and you go to these distilleries, you typically will see like what you see here on the right. This is Dingle. I'm actually wearing my Dingle shirt. This is Dingle, beautiful place. They're making some great whiskey. I don't know if you can get this in California too easily or not, but you can probably find their gins and vodkas, but their whiskey is pretty darn good too. But they do 3 stills in Ireland. They have a first still, which is their wash still. They have what's called an intermediate still, which would be the middle still. And then they have their spirit still, which is the last still. And in Ireland, they like this triple distillation. That's kind of one of their things. Not everybody does it there now. There's a lot of double distillation, but if you were to talk to any true Irish whiskey enthusiast, it's all about triple distilling. And then what we're going to talk about right now, which is the Green Spot, which is our next whiskey. This is what you call a pot still whiskey. So pot still is a very specific term for Ireland. Pot still is using these stills as we're looking at right now, these copper beautiful stills. But what they're doing is they're using malted barley, they're using barley. Barley is the main ingredient. So we talked about corn, that was bourbon. We talked about rye, that could be the US, it could be Canada. Actually, they do some rye in Ireland too. But when you talk about single malt whiskey, typically you're talking about barley. And back in the 19th century in Ireland, when they were making whiskey with barley, the taxman had a way of taxing these distillers. And the Irish are pretty smart and they're cunning and sly. And what they did is the taxman was only taxing these distilleries on their malted barley. And what malted is, and I'll explain that now because it's something we're going to be looking at as we go through Scotland. Basically, you're cutting the barley from the field, the grain, okay? And you're drying it. And then you're bringing it to a malting house. And what you're doing is, in order to open up the grain so that you can actually access the sugars within the starches within the kernels, or the starches, not the sugars, within the kernels, is you want to germinate it. And what that means is you're going to trick this dried grain or seeds to think that they're going to grow. Okay, so you're going to put some water on these seeds, on this grain, and you're actually going to trick it into germinating or actually sprouting. Eventually, after a couple of days of being soaked in water and with some warmer temperatures, they will start to sprout. And you want to let those sprouts happen for 2 to 3 days. And then at that point, you want to kill it. You want to cut it off from growing anymore. You don't want to grow a plant. That's not the purpose of malting. You want to open up the seed so you can access the starches within it. But then you want to cut it. You don't want to sprout it and grow into a plant. So the Irish were just being taxed on the malted barley, which is typically what was used back in the day for making whiskey. And so they said, all right, well, how about we use a combination of malted barley and unmalted barley? So they started experimenting with these different percentages of malted and unmalted to avoid having to pay the taxes on the malted barley, which is genius, I have to say. The Irish are genius. And this became a new style of whiskey. It actually is a very different flavor because you're using some grain that's germinated and malted, and then you're using some grain that's raw. And this raw grain that you're adding to the recipe actually brings a lot of spice. It brings a lot of this kind of Irish nuanced spice. So when we're drinking this green spot, this is a single pot still whiskey. So this is going to have that spice on it. Now, this is a 40% ABV, so this isn't a very high proof whiskey. However, it's going to have a very different kind of characteristic with this spice. It's 7 to 10 years. It's using different casks, and we haven't really talked a lot about cask types yet. Well, we will. And this is 100% barley, but again, it's a combination of malted and unmalted barley. Now, it does use, yeah, go ahead.
Does this take it? To me, it's a bit florally and bright and light and.
Definitely.
Am I wrong in that one?
No, not at all. It's definitely, it has the floral, it has this, it actually has citrus. You kind of have this, it's definitely bright, like you said.
Yeah.
It's, and it's 40%, so it's a lighter whiskey too. However, that's the Irish style though. It's gonna have that floral characteristic, but it has that little bit of spice. It's just kind of on the back end. It's a low proof whiskey, so it's not gonna come out too strong. I don't know if any of you've had Redbreast. Redbreast is great. They have a variety of aged. It's the same distillery actually as Green Spot, but theirs is you get a lot more spice that's coming from the pot still. This is a little bit kind of lighter on that side. Now, what they did with this, and we will talk about this in a sec, but there are 3 different types of casks that they aged this whiskey into, and this is where some of those characteristics come from. You have an ex-bourbon cask. So you have a cask that actually had bourbon in it in the US that was broken down and sent over to Ireland, and they put the whiskey in it. And then you have what's called a refill bourbon cask, which means it's a cask that originally had bourbon in it, came to Ireland, they put Irish whiskey in it, they took the Irish whiskey out, and now they're putting Irish whiskey back in it. Okay, it's a second time, a refill. Okay, it's not the first fill, it's the refill. And then the third cask that they're using in this is a sherry cask, which would come from Spain, which would bring some of that sweetness, some of that floral. So you're gonna get some of the vanilla from the bourbon, but then you're also gonna get some of the sweetness from the sherry. So they combine all of these casks together, they batch them together, they marry them together, and this is what this is. So it's a combination of 3 different types of casks in this one. Now, Green Spot, we know it's at least 7 to 10 years. They have a yellow spot, which is 10 years. We know, or no, yellow spot's 12 years. Then you have the red spot, which is 15 years. I actually have a red spot behind me. Red Spot's a beautiful, beautiful whiskey. And then they just came out with the blue spot. It's a brand new whiskey. It's pretty hard to get. I got a bottle a couple of months ago. It was very expensive. like $130. But it's a 7-year whiskey. But it's cash strength, so it's a much higher proof. It's like 56% ABV, so it's up there. Now these spots are interesting. So back when they were aging whiskey in the warehouse, they would actually take a paintbrush and put a colored spot on the barrel, depending on how old it was. So that's where these colors are coming from. So the green is for 10 years. The yellow is for 12, the red is for 15, and the blue is for 7. So when you're in the store, you'll see these. These are pretty much available. The red spot's pretty hard to get, but you'll see the green and the yellow spot quite a bit in stores. And that's where those colors come from. So it's kind of fun. So I'm not going to talk about this yet. So these tall stills. We did talk about the coffee stills. So these are these continuous stills. These are these really tall, long stills. They're just newer. They look more like they came out of Kentucky. And then here's Ireland. You can see how many distilleries are now in Ireland, and there's so many new ones. It's really blowing up. They're going through a revolution right now in whiskey, which is really a lot of fun. And it's great to go back and see all these places. Stop the share. So what do you guys think about the green spot? You like it? Is this one you've had before? Yeah, a couple people, yeah. Okay, so this next whiskey, where are we at? 1040, 740 your time. We're doing okay. I'll be able to catch up here. We'll be good by 8:30. So this next whiskey is Writer's Tears. This is a fun one. I know I'm giving you guys a lot of information, and I don't expect you to retain it all. It's quite overwhelming, but please ask questions. You know, if there's anything that you're confused about, or you know, you want to know about, you know, just let me know. But Writer's Tears, it comes from, well, it used to come from a distillery, from the Walsh Whiskey Distillery, which is in Carlow, Ireland. And I went there shortly after they opened in 2016. And the Walsh family was really innovative, and they had lived in Europe, and they had some relationships with the French, and especially some of the cognac makers in France. And so they were able to access some cognac barrels and use those for some of their whiskeys. But the distillery where they were originally, they ended up selling to an Italian group, and now the distillery is called the Royal Oak Distillery in Carlow, and the Walsh group is now making their whiskey out of Middleton, which is where Green Spot is made. They're just basically using their stills and making their own recipe using somebody else's equipment. So they technically don't have a distillery right now, their own distillery, which they used to have. However, their whiskeys are still pretty great. And they're very unique. And what I really like about Writer's Tears, well, the name is pretty fun, but they do a very unique style of whiskey. So we just talked about pot still Irish whiskey, which was that combination of malted and unmalted barley, and, you know, avoiding the tax man and saving some money and all that. So they take pot still whiskey, and then they take single malt whiskey, which we really haven't talked too much about yet, but that's really what they do in Scotland. Single malt whiskey is basically 100% malted barley, okay? Again, this is what the Irish were trying to get away from, saving some money with the taxes, but the traditional way was 100% malted barley. So they would germinate the grain, they would malt it, kill it, and then, you know, use that grain for their mashing and their fermenting and their distilling. However, Writer's Tears, Walsh whiskey, they took a combination of both. So you have pot still, which is a combination of unmalted and malted barley, and you took single malt, which is 100% malted barley, and they mixed the two together. Nobody else does that anywhere. It's a completely unique style of whiskey. It's really unique in that way. I don't even know how they even came up with the idea to do that from the beginning. They did that from the beginning. This wasn't something that they were like, let's try pot still and then we'll eventually try to experiment and do some other combinations. They did this combination from the start, which I thought was pretty unique. Now this one that we're having tonight is called the Double Oak. It's 46%, so we're going back up a little bit. Not a lot, but a little bit, 92 proof. This is first aged in ex-bourbon. Well, it's a combination of ex-bourbon and, well, no, it's aged first in ex-bourbon. And then what they did is they took these cognac casks, so these French oak casks, and they aged it in French oak. So it's, you know, the French oak gives it kind of this, so you have the ex-bourbon, which will give it this vanilla note, but then you have the French oak that gives it kind of these tannins. We're kind of getting back into maybe some of the wine region, you know, Northern California stuff. So, you know, we talk about tannins with wines and the oak. And so you're going to get a lot of that cognac influence from the French oak, you know, the tannins and some of these other things. So it's, I think it's a beautiful whiskey. This one actually won, was in the top 10 in 2019 in world whiskeys that were released. It is one that you can find. You should be able to find this locally, but it's unique. It's a combination of two different styles of whiskey, but it's also a combination of two different barrels. And you know, it's a decent proof, and it's a nice one. I thought it would be a nice kind of change of pace from the Green Spot. Back in the 17th and 18th century in Ireland, French oak was all over the place. That's when they actually had forests still in France. You know, a lot of these forests, not just in France, but also in Ireland and in Scotland, you know, they disappeared. All this wood was being used to, you know, survive and do things with, build houses, whatever. So French oak, you know, is something now that's really, really regulated, you know, similar to some of the American oak that we deal with now. But French oak back in the day was what was primarily used. And then once American bourbons started to be made more and more in the 19th century, and eventually those barrels started coming over to Ireland and Scotland, the French oak went down and the American oak went up. And now it's mostly American oak. I mean, we're talking 80% bourbon barrels, you know, and it's the easiest barrels to come by. Again, we're going back to the first rule that we learned, which was bourbon has to be made in a new charred American oak barrel. Once it's done, it's got to go, you know, and they can't make bourbon out of it again. So it goes over to Ireland, it goes to Scotland. And, you know, there's just not enough French barrels anymore. There's cognac's not in fashion anymore. Sherry is not in fashion, so it's really hard to get sherry barrels now. It's hard to get port barrels. All of these different types of barrels from Europe are very difficult to get or very expensive. You know, an American oak is a lot cheaper. So there's a lot of reasons for it. But back in the day, French oak was a big one. That's changed a lot, obviously. On the nose on this, on the smell, you get a lot of that cognac. Definitely comes through. All right, anybody have any questions on Irish whiskey? There is one last category of Irish whiskey that we didn't talk about. You guys are quiet. Usually by now there's like a lot of chatter and, you know, I don't know if you're all on mute or not. Yeah, you all are on mute. You guys are so quiet. My goodness. I'm like talking to myself here tonight.
Sorry about that. We'll speak up.
No, it's okay.
We have screaming kids in the background.
No, I hear you. I understand what that's about. So.
Actually, those are Ryan's kids that are screaming through the Zoom call, I think.
That's also mine. You're welcome.
It's Porter and the
Yes.
Fun Boy. And
It's a good team.
Most of my days are Tristan screaming, Evan, stop, Evan, stop. I don't know what they're doing, but they have a lot of fun.
Yes.
We've also been on so many Zooms over the last year that, you know, at some point you kind of zoom out, right? I mean,
So the only difference between green spot and yellow spot was the age, is that right?
yeah, and so one of the other things you'll find, green spot specifically, they will actually finish some of their whiskeys in different types of casks. So you could go into a store and see a green spot that's finished in Zinfandel or in Cabernet Sauvignon or something else. So there's a lot of varieties of green spot that are out there, and there's not so many. There are a couple of yellow spots, but typically it's the age. That's the main differentiator.
And I work with a guy from Ireland, so we go through a lot of Irish whiskeys, and we usually contract signings involve a bottle of Middleton.
Yeah.
And so but why is that one sort of, because that one's probably like $120 a bottle or something.
Yeah, it's more actually. So there's the Middleton Very Rare, which is probably what you're talking about. Because they don't really brand, you don't find anything really that's just called Middleton. It's going to be the Middleton Very Rare, which is kind of their lower end, which is very high end whiskey to begin with. And then they have some really high end Middletons. And I've tasted some of those and they're really phenomenal. But the Middleton Very Rare, which is typically a retail of around 150 or so. I mean, I don't know, maybe California is a little cheaper. But it's basically an expression that's released every year. So every year is a little different. And it's the distiller's discretion on how they want that bottle to be. And, you know, so it's become collectible. You know, whenever you have something that comes out once a year and it's got a date on it, it's got the year on it, you know, and
it has the invitation to come visit the distillery.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, actually, I do, when I go there, I do it's kind of a pretty high-end tour, and you end up in the distiller's house drinking some of that, which is pretty phenomenal. And you go in the cooperage that they have there, and they have a special bottle you drink in the cooperage. And we haven't really talked about barrels too much, but that's where they make the barrels, is in the cooperage. Yeah, Middleton's great. I mean, it's a monster place. It's huge. Jameson, I mean, think Jameson. Jameson's gigantic, you know, and sold all over the world. And but they make some great products. I mean, Redbreast is fantastic. I have so this is the red spot. This is a really fun one. So this is bourbon, sherry, and marsala. So you have marsala in it, but that's the red spot there. Now this is expensive, hard to get. I've actually seen this one being sold for a couple $100s now, so it's getting up there in price. But those they're a lot of fun. Those whiskeys, they're really great. But the last category that we didn't talk about in Ireland is single malt. We talked about it being combined with pot still for this Writer's Tears, but there are distilleries now that are making single malt Irish whiskey. Kilbeggan's doing it. The tasting I did with Noah a couple months ago, we did one called Waterford. Waterford is a newer distillery in Ireland that you're going to hear about. So get your pencil out and write down Waterford. They make, you know, it's the town where they make crystal. So a lot of you have the Waterford crystal sets or whatever, but in the town itself is a new distillery that was actually an old Guinness brewery, but they built a beautiful, beautiful new distillery. It's been open about 5 years now. It's not open to the public, but they're making single malt. So they're basically doing what they do in Scotland, but they're doing it in Ireland. And in Scotland, since that's our next, and I'll pull up some slides on Scotland, but in Scotland, for the most part, what we drink in the United States is a blend. So that would be your Dewar's, your Chivas, you know, some of these other big blends that you see in stores, or your single malts. Single malts would be these, you know, incredibly aged whiskeys that we see in stores. But that's what they're mostly making that we get in the US is either a blend, which would be usually a cheaper Scotch, or a single malt, which is typically a more expensive Scotch. And a single malt, and I'll pull up the slide, but they're doing that in Ireland. So that's the other category right now in Ireland that's becoming big. And Waterford is leading, or one of the leaders of that kind of new Irish category. And one of the reasons behind it is, you know, they say that Ireland's is so lush. You know, there's so much rain and it's so green and it's a beautiful, beautiful place. The barley in Ireland is better than the barley in Scotland. So why not make the same kind of whiskey that they're making in Scotland in Ireland with this great barley, you know? So that's their whole purpose behind it. And this guy who started Waterford came from Scotland, opened Waterford, is making, you know, a very terroir driven whiskey, you know, which is earth, you know, like you hear in the Wine Valley or in the Sonoma and Napa, the terroir is important just as it is in France and all these other places. It's the same with whiskey, with barley. You know, the ground matters, the soil matters. You know, it's all part of it. So that's the other category that's starting to blow up in Ireland, which is pretty fun because that's only going to make it better. You know, all of these things are only going to make it better. All right, let me pull up Scotland before we get into these last three. I know we're at 8 o'clock already here. Make sure I pull up the right slide here. Okay.
That's a tour.
All right, here we go. Actually, I'm going to go here. Don't look at this. I don't want you to get sick going too fast through the slides. All right. So Scotland. Here's Scotland. I know this map might be hard to see. I know it's a shared screen, so it's not too big. But Scotland has over 130 distilleries right now. So there's a lot of distilleries. You know, Scotland's just north of the UK here. It's, you know, it's part of England. But you have two cities. You have Edinburgh and Glasgow, which are both kind of right along this line. I don't know if you can see my mouse. I think you can. But right along this line here. And basically anything below that line is the lowlands of Scotland. Anything above that line is the highlands of Scotland. So the Highlands is a big portion of Scotland. The Highlands is where most of the distilleries are in Scotland. And then you have one area in Scotland that's called the Speyside, where you have the highest concentration of distilleries in Scotland. There are over 60 distilleries in just this one area. It's a really wonderful place to visit because you can go to all these places without having to drive too far. And you know, you can see a bunch of them in a day without having to be on the road for too long. So the Speyside, I have a slide on that next, but there's two other areas in Scotland that are really important to talk about. One of them is Islay. This is on the southwest corner of Scotland. It's an island. There are now 9 distilleries on Islay. Islay is a fantastic place. I've been a bunch of times now. It's got some of the biggest distilleries that you've heard of, more of the smoky ones. So not all whiskey from Scotland is smoky, but a lot of the Islay ones are smoky. You have Laphroaig, you have Ardbeg, you have Lagavulin, Bunnahabhain. There's a bunch of great distilleries on Islay. Those are all right here in the southwest corner of Scotland. And then you have this whole area of the islands. You have these islands outside and all the way up here to Orkney, which is the very, very top of Scotland. That's where Highland Park is. I don't know if any of you know Highland Park. But so you have all these different kind of categories of whiskey that come from Scotland based on the different geographic regions that these distilleries are located. And then you have one last area, which is Campbelltown, which is down here. It's this peninsula. There's two really famous distilleries down there. There's Springbank and Glen Scotia. Both are down in Campbelltown. But here's the Speyside. So Speyside, again, is that region that's very concentrated in distilleries. You have Balvenie, Glenfiddich, Glenlivet, you have Aberlour. I mean, you have so many. There's so many wonderful distilleries in this area. The next whiskey that we're doing is from the Speyside. So I wanted to go ahead and we can all pour ourselves this next whiskey while we're looking at this slide. But it's the Singleton 12-year. So Singleton is in the Speyside region. Singleton's a very old distillery. Goes all the way back to 1897. They actually have 3 distilleries. So the Singleton brand actually owns 3 distilleries right now. One of them is called Glendullan, which is what we're drinking tonight. It's the 12-year Glendullan, which is a very light, fruity, creamy Scotch. There's no smoke on this. This is definitely not a whiskey that is gonna, put anybody off. This is a great starter Scotch. If there was ever a starter Scotch, this is a great one to kind of drink because it's very easy to drink. It's 40% ABV. It's not too overwhelming. But Singleton has 3 different distilleries. They have Glendullan, which is sold here in the United States for the most part. They have Glen Ord, which is another distillery, which is sold in Asia. So mostly in Hong Kong and Taiwan and Japan and other places. And then they have Dufton, which is their other distillery, which is sold mostly in Europe. So France, Italy, all over Europe. So they have these 3 different distilleries. They're all different styles of whiskey though, which is really interesting. The world, and we're doing a tasting around the world has palates dependent upon where you are from and what you are drinking. So the Asian market has their own palate. They have whiskeys that they like based on, just their culture, what they eat, what their climate is, what they're used to. It's really interesting. And then we have this US, which is more kind of a bourbon market, right? So we like the bourbon casks. We're much more kind of vanilla forward. We like, so this Singleton is like that, even though there is some sherry cask in that, but it's kind of this lighter vanilla bourbony, whiskey. And then you have France or Europe, which is used to more of maybe the sherry and the French oak and some of these other, casks that have more wine influence, right? So it's interesting how Singleton has picked these 3 different distilleries. They make different whiskeys for different parts of the world. The Glendullan, which is what you find here in the US, they do a 12, a 15, and 18-year-old Glendullan. The 15 is really fantastic. I really like that one a lot. It's reasonable as well. But this is fantastic. If there's anybody that has never had Scotch before, but who's really afraid of trying a Scotch, I always, the Singleton 12 is really one of those that's easy to drink. I've done tastings all over New York State with this whiskey, and I haven't found many people that, if you're a connoisseur, if you're a real whiskey drinker, then maybe this isn't your thing because it's a little too easy to drink. Maybe you're looking for some more oomph or whatever, but for somebody who's getting into it, this is a really great whiskey. So cheers for that. But one of the things I wanted to go to, let me get there. So these are the different regions, so these are the different types of whiskey that are made in Scotland. I thought this would be pretty interesting to look at. So we have single malt, which is what we're drinking right now. So it's single distillery. This is Singleton of Glendullan. 100% malted barley. Again, we talked about the pot still Irish, which is malted and unmalted. Scotland, they don't do that. It's 100% malted barley. Not all distilleries will malt their own. Not all have malting floors anymore where they actually do the malting process in-house. It's a very expensive process and it takes a lot of time. So a lot of them have their grains malted outside and then they bring it in and make their whiskey. But some still do have their own malting floors and they use pot stills. But then we have what you would find in the US that's most common is the last little box here, which is blended Scotch. So that would be Dewar's, that would be Chivas, that would be some of the other blended Scotches. Basically, you're taking a single malt, which is what we started with, what we're drinking right now, and then you're taking some grain whiskey, which is made using that coffee still, that continuous column still that we saw pictures of. So when you blend those two together, that makes a blended Scotch. Okay. Same thing in Ireland. Jameson, for example, they take barley and grain, they blend it. That's a blended Irish whiskey. It's the same concept. It's just Irish and it's triple distilled. In Scotland, they're only double distilling. Okay. They're not using that third still. So those are the big differences. I know it's technical and all, but that's kind of what it's all about. So a single malt is one distillery, 100% malted barley, one distilling season. It's all done on in-house and it's using pot stills. There's no column stills, there's no coffee stills, just pot stills, those beautiful big copper pot stills. Blended Scotch, on the other hand, is a combination of that and grain whiskey, which is made with those tall stills, which is what they do with bourbon. You know, we saw that they use those tall continuous column stills and then they go to a pot still. So it's different. It's kind of almost like backwards in a way. But those are the big differences. There are some other categories here: blended malt, single grain. Single grain is interesting. So single grain is coming from those long column stills. And it's just that. It's not pot stills at all. It's just grain. So it could be corn, it could be wheat, it could be rye. And single grains are starting to catch on, especially the older ones. The longer you age a single grain, the better it is. I'm not going to go through the process of making. We kind of saw that with bourbon, but I do want to go to this, which is the different types of casks. We haven't talked a lot about casks, but this is really important as we go through these next couple of whiskeys as well. So I know it's not the clearest picture, but this second barrel is a bourbon barrel. Okay, so this is what we're getting from the US. This is a 200-liter barrel from the US. Now, they don't send the barrel over as a barrel. They send it over as staves. Okay, so they're all pieces. You know, these rings come off. They're all sent over as staves, just pieces of wood. And then they repurpose those barrels and make them back into a barrel. And then they re-char it. They actually will re-char it once it's made. So that's a bourbon barrel, 200 liters. They have what's called a quarter barrel, which is the one to the left of it, which is a smaller version, 125 liters. You will see some scotches that are aged in a quarter barrel. When you have a smaller area of whiskey to wood ratio, which is what you would get in a quarter barrel, you're going to have more wood influence. There's more whiskey actually touching the wood. Okay, so you're going to get more of whatever that barrel was, whether it's bourbon, sherry, whatever, you're going to get more influence because there's more contact. Okay, so a quarter barrel, and there's even smaller ones called octaves. Those, you know, really intense oak contact with the whiskey. So you get a lot of quicker kind of maturation aging with that. Then you have a hogshead, which is the third one here. A hogshead's really interesting. I love the name, first of all. I think it's a great name. But basically, it's a bourbon barrel, and they add more staves. They make it bigger. So it's 250 liters instead of 200 liters. But it's basically a bourbon barrel. It's just fatter. So again, a little less whiskey to wood contact than a regular bourbon barrel. So you get a little less influence from that that bourbon you know, that was originally in that wood. And then these last three are all different styles of wine. So you have a puncheon, which would be different types of wine. And then you have a pipe, which would be a port, typically a port pipe, from Portugal. Those are really big. We're getting up there, 480 liters. And then you have your sherry butt. The sherry butt's the biggest, 600 liters, huge. We're talking 3 times the size of a bourbon barrel. So they like their butts big in Sherryland. But it's, sherry is becoming hard to get. Not many people drink sherry like they used to. Sherry used to be something that you would have before dinner or maybe after dinner. It's definitely an old school drink. It's not something we typically pull out of the cabinet anymore. Similar with port, even though maybe port a little more than sherry. So sherry is harder to get. And so what these distilleries have done in order to get sherry barrels is they've actually purchased bodegas or places where they make sherry in Spain in order to control the process so that they're guaranteed to get these barrels afterwards. That's how important it is now for these distilleries to actually get these barrels to age their whiskey in. We've all heard of Macallan. Macallan is like the Rolls Royce of Scotch whiskey. It's a very expensive but sherry focused Scotch whiskey. It's good, it's pricey, but it's good, but it's sherry. Most of it's all sherry. There's some bourbon, but most of it's sherry. They own a number of distilleries in Spain that make sherry so they can get those barrels. Other distilleries own forests, actual forests in the US, so they can control the fact that they're going to eventually get those bourbon barrels. They actually own the forest in Minnesota to get the white oak. That's how big of a deal it is now for Scotch whiskey distilleries. They actually control a lot of the process. They own some of the cooperages, which is, you can see these pictures here, these guys making these barrels on the bottom. It's a huge deal, and if ever the rule changed in the US where bourbon could be made using a refill, you could put bourbon in a cask that's been used, that would change the game. There's been a little bit of talk about it, but I don't think it's ever going to happen. It would change the game too much. But it's really interesting how it's all integrated. The US whiskey market, the Irish whiskey market, the Scotch whiskey market, everything's intertwined. Everything is connected.
I want to put in a plug, folks. I want to put in a plug for sherry. I love using sherry in cocktails. You can use a medium, an off-dry sherry, and a Amontillado sherry, or a Fino sherry, which is much more dry. And I recently discovered it like last year and actually won a cocktail contest using an off-dry sherry. So it's not that, it's not that expensive, and it's good for a low ABV cocktail, but go ahead and buy that sherry and then we can still have fun.
And you're supporting the whiskey market when you do. So, there's not, sherries, brandies, cognacs, there is a little bit of a comeback happening right now as well, which is exciting. There's some brandy, there's here in Vermont, which is close to me, there's a new company called Bacta, and they have some incredible barrels of cognac that they've brought over from France. And there's a lot of stuff in California happening with brandies too, but sherry is huge. I think that, like, for cocktails, like you said, amazing. The Amontillado for whiskey is incredible. The Fino sherries are incredible as well for finishing and aging and all of that. So definitely an area to keep on and enjoy, because there's a lot going on there still, and it's just harder to get, and these distilleries are realizing that, and so they're really trying to figure out how to control that process and guarantee that they get the wood that they need to keep making the whiskey that they're doing. And again, these whiskeys are aging for long periods of time. So we didn't talk about that too much. They talked about it a tiny bit in the video, the evaporation that happens during the aging process. So in Kentucky or in Texas or in some of these warmer climates where they're aging whiskey right now, the evaporation, or the whiskey that's leaving the wood, that's leaving into the atmosphere, is really fast. He said on the video, after 7 years, you're at half a barrel at that point. Now, it's not like that in Scotland because it's not as hot. You don't have those temperature fluctuations like you have in Kentucky. In Kentucky, it gets really hot in the summer. I've been in a rickhouse in the summer. It's over 100 degrees. And then they get snow sometimes, not all the time, but they can get snow or ice or whatever, and it gets cold. It gets in the 30s and 40s for most of the winter, which is short, but it still fluctuates a lot. And you get about a 4 to 5% evaporation per year in Kentucky. It's up there. In Texas, it's even higher. Texas gets really hot, and it doesn't get that cold in the winter. I mean, in some parts it does, but most places in Texas, it's mild in the winter compared to most winter states or whatever. So you get a much higher. You're getting 6-7% evaporation per year. So some of these whiskeys that you see coming out of Texas or some of these southern states, just because they're 4 years doesn't mean they're young or they're not going to taste good. There's this influence from the wood that's happening faster than it would in other parts of the world. So in India, there are whiskeys now, and I've tasted a number of whiskeys from India, and some of them are fantastic. The angel share there is like 10%. It's even higher. And angel share means it goes to the angels. The angels enjoy the whiskey that evaporates up into the sky. But so they're like freaking out. They don't know how to control that angel share. So what they do is they build their warehouses underground. So they actually store some of their barrels in mountainsides or underground to control that evaporation, because the humidity is so high in India. And some of these places, one of them, the famous places is in Goa, which is on the very southern tip of India. Talk about humidity. I mean, if you think we have humidity here, I mean, go to Goa. It's a whole nother planet. So, it's a big deal, but in Scotland, it's 2 to 3%. So the angel share is a lot slower. So the climate in Scotland and in Ireland is more, it's similar to San Francisco in a way, right? So you're out in the fog. I grew up in the Richmond district near Ocean Beach. I knew one climate pretty much all year. I mean, we had some magical days where the fog would disappear and we'd all run to the beach and burn ourselves basically. But unless you went downtown or across the bay to Oakland, we didn't see sun. It was fog for, I want to say 60% of the year. But, that's like Scotland in a way, right? I mean, it's 50, 60 degrees year round. It gets down into the 40s, it might get into the 30s, and it might get up to 70, and maybe they have a miraculous 80 or 90 degree day, but for the most part, it's 50, 60, 65, in that range, right? So the angel share, or the whiskey going into the wood and coming back out of the wood, is much lower than Kentucky or some of these other places. So that's why they have these really old whiskeys. And age doesn't mean everything, but that's why you can have a 30-year-old Scotch or even older. You can't have that in Kentucky. You get to 15 years, you're pretty much at your max. I mean, yes, there are 20-year and 23 years and whatever, you can get up there, but for the most part, you get to 15, you're done in Kentucky. I mean, 12, you're pushing it. 15, you're really pushing it, depending on your rickhouse and where things are stored and all that. But 10 years, 8 years, that's more of the sweet spot in Kentucky. Whereas in Scotland, it could be much older because it takes longer to age. So that's kind of fun. That gets back into the woods. So I'm talking too much. We need to go to the next whiskey. I'm running out of time here. Oh my God. Again, I don't have to go anywhere, but I don't know if you guys do. So that's my whole thing.
Hey, Charles, you might have answered this, but why are the Scottish whiskeys without the E in them?
Great question. And I was going to talk about that and I forgot. So there's no rhyme or reason technically behind it, other than the fact that the Irish like to distinguish themselves, and America did as well. And so in Canada, for the most part, you don't see the E. In the US, for the most part, you do see the E, even though now you're starting not to see the E with some distilleries that are making single malt. And then in Ireland, now you're seeing both as well. You're seeing the E and no E, like Waterford, which I talked about, the newer single malt distillery in Ireland. They're not using an E. So there's no like you're not whiskey if you're not using an E or an E. It's basically an old, it's like where you came from, right? So these Scottish distilleries that are, you know, so old, like this next one, this is the perfect segue. Oban. I love Oban. Oban's one of my first whiskeys. They go back to 1794. I mean, we're talking a long time ago. You know, they don't use an E. They never used an E. They're not going to put an E in at this point. You know, basically that's kind of how it works. The Scots like to not use an E. The Japanese don't like to use an E because the Japanese basically copied everything from Scotland and made it better. The Irish like to put an E to be different. Again, they don't like to pay their taxes either, and that's why they make pot still whiskey, which is great. And the Americans are all over the place. So there's no rhyme or reason. But Oban, which is our next whiskey, this is fantastic. I don't know if you've had Oban before. This was the whiskey that actually got me into the whiskey world back now over 20 years ago. I was actually living in Nashville, and you would think I want to be drinking Jack Daniels or Dickel or going up to Kentucky and drinking all these great bourbons. I didn't know anything about any of that. I came from San Francisco. You know, you think of the South, you're like, oh my God, I don't know anything about the South. So I didn't know anything, but I was introduced to Oban in a restaurant, I think, or a bar. And I was like, whoa, what is this? I've never had anything like it. And from that point on, I was like, wow, I'm hooked. I need to have a bottle of this on my bar. Now, Oban 14, this is a 14-year-old single malt. This has been in the US since 1988 is when they first released this expression, the 14-year-old Oban, into the US. So it's been a long time. There weren't a lot of single malts back in the 80s that were in the US at the time. There was Glenfiddich, Glenlivet, Macallan, you know, Balvenie, some of the bigger names. But Oban is a tiny little distillery. It's one of the greatest stories ever. It's this beautiful place. It's on the coast, so it's not a Speyside. So again, we looked at that one region, which was all that concentration of distilleries. This is on the west coast. It's a little village fishing port on the west coast of Scotland. The town itself grew up around the distillery. This distillery is so old that the distillery was one of the first major establishments in the town. The town grew up around it. Still to this day, only 7 people work there, which is fantastic. They had 6 people working there until about like 6 years ago, and they upped it to 7, and everybody's like, oh my God, you're expanding. And the reality is they can't expand. The town grew up around them. They have no room. They're trapped. They don't mind that because they do well and they like what they do, and they only make so much whiskey a year and people love it. But it's different. It's not Speyside. So we just had that Singleton of Glendullan, which is very light, fruity, floral. You know, this one has a little more power to it. Okay, not a lot more power, but a little more power to it. It's more, there is more citrus in it, but it has a tiny bit of that coastal influence. So you're going to get some of that salinity, a little bit of the sea salt, a little bit of that coastal air that comes into the warehouse. This isn't happening from the stills or the fermentation or the, you know, any of that. This is coming from the aging on the coast. Okay, it's getting that air that's coming into the warehouse. You know, so it's providing some of that coastal influence to it. Now, this isn't a Talisker, which is a little further north, which is much more smoky. This is just a whiff of smoke. just a whiff. You're not getting a lot, but there's just a tiny, tiny bit. It's actually 0.5% of peated barley. And I'll talk about peat here in a second when we get to our last whiskey, but this one has a little more power, a little more body, but I love it. I think it just has a lot of layers. Citrus, it's kind of a combination of the coast and Speyside. Little floral, but it has that salty coastal element as well. And it's a little higher ABV. It's 43%. The Singleton was 40%. Definitely get oranges. There's citrus on this, big time. And there's a little bit of heather. We haven't talked about heather, but heather is a beautiful plant. I mean, we see it in the US too, but it's purple and, you know, it's grown all over, it's wild all over northern Scotland specifically. But you get some of that in the grain. It comes forward, the floral elements, this heather element comes through. It's a beautiful, I think this is a beautifully balanced whiskey for a 14-year-old single malt.
We all really like this one.
So we talked, I mentioned just briefly now about smoke. We talked about malting the barley. We talked about it when we were in Ireland, about the tax stuff and how they avoided that. Well, when you're malting the barley in Scotland, there's two ways to do it. One, you can do it like Singleton, like our first Scotch, where they use hot air to kill the germination. So again, remember, we're tricking the seed into sprouting. We're tricking the seed into growing into a plant. And you want to kill it, you want to cut it, stop it at 2 to 3 days. There's two ways to do it. One is hot air, just hot air. Dry it, and using big kilns of hot air. It comes right up through the floor. The floor is like mesh. So you have all this wet grain on top of a mesh, and they just force hot air up through the floor, the mesh floor, and it kills that germination. It just malts it. The other way to do it is with peat, P-E-A-T. So we know from our gardens that we use peat moss when we want to add nutrients and, you know, extra oomph to our gardens to give it, you know, I use a lot of peat moss when I was doing my vegetables and stuff here. A lot of that comes from Canada. Canada has a lot of these boggy areas, and Florida has some too, but a lot of boggy is northern border. So northern United States, whether it's the Minnesota or Canada, that's where a lot of that peat moss comes from that we use for our gardens. It comes from Canada. So in Scotland, they have a lot of peat bogs too. Again, this is earth that's been compressed over tens of thousands of years. This is earth that just over time gets compressed. It's more earth and gets compressed. And basically, back in the day, they used to use peat as a source of fuel. So they would cut peat out of the ground, and I've cut peat in Scotland. It's tough. It's not an easy process. But one of the, you know, when you go to Lafroig in Islay, they have a great experience where you can actually go with one of the main people and actually cut your own peat. And it's hard. It's not easy. You got to put on these big, tall rubber boots. They're called wellies, and get out there in the mud and you cut these things. And then you let it dry and it creates bricks. But it's this compressed earth. It's really compressed. It's like bricks. It's really solid. And you let it dry for like 6 months to 8 months. And then they take those peat bricks and they light it, and it's used as a source of fuel. So back in the day, they used to heat their homes with that. They would use it for other sources of fuel, but they also made or malted their barley with peat. Okay, so instead of using just hot air, you know, from a oil or gas oven, they would basically burn peat bricks, and that smoke would then get infused right into the grain. Okay, again, this open, remember when it's germinating, the sprout is coming out, it's just barely coming out, it's open, it's cracked open. So you're killing it right then. So the smoke is coming right into that grain at that point. So that's where you're getting the smoky taste from some of these whiskeys. Now this last whiskey that we're doing, the Lagavulin 16, is a very special whiskey. This is not a cheap bottle. These are going for close to $100 now. And this is a really beautiful whiskey. It's the classic Islay, which is that island on the southwest corner of Scotland. It's the classic Islay expression. It's 9 distilleries now there. Most of them are producing peated whiskey. So they're malting their barley by infusing it with these bricks of peat. And I've been there, I've seen the ovens, I've seen the smoke go right into the grain. It's pretty amazing. That all happens at the very beginning. It's not happening during the mashing or the fermenting or the distilling or the aging. It's happening right at the beginning, right when they're malting this grain, right after it's cut, and it's dried and they're ready to use this barley. And they open it up with the germination and they infuse it with the smoke. It's not coming from anywhere else. A lot of people are like, oh, it's got to be from the barrels or it's got to be from this or that. It's from the peat that comes right at the very beginning of the process. It's pretty amazing. Most people think it's from the aging, which makes sense. You get all these other influences of whiskey from the wood, but smoky whiskey, it comes from that very beginning. So Lagavulin 16 has won a ton of awards. Some of you guys know Offerman from Parks and Recreation. You guys ever watch that show? So he's a huge Lagavulin fan. If you go on to YouTube and type Offerman Lagavulin, some of the videos are just hilarious. He does one where he spends New Year's Eve in front of the distillery sitting in like a lawn chair with a glass, like this of Lagavulin, and they're all partying in the back. And he doesn't move an inch for like 3 hours. And they're just like, this party is going on in the back, and he's just sitting there with his Lagavulin and just smelling it and enjoying it. And that's his New Year's Eve video, and it's classic. You should go on there and check it out. He does one on Oban actually from a while back too. He was a big Oban fan, which I love because that was my first whiskey too. So it's kind of fun that he loves these. But the Lagavulin 16 has won a ton of awards. Now, this isn't going to be for everyone. Again, remember that 3-sip rule that I told you guys early on? This is one of those. So if you're not a big smoky fan, think barbecue, think campfire, think, all of that. But think 3 sips. Don't just sip once and say, I can't do it. Your palate has to get used to this. So that first sip, again, don't judge this whiskey on the first sip. This is a combination of ex-bourbon and sherry barrels as well. So there's a little bit of sweetness. You have to find that through the smoke. It's a little bit of work. It is the last whiskey we're doing tonight, but I do this on purpose. We don't want a smoky whiskey early on, and then you're trying to figure out how your palate's going to adjust to that. This is a good one to kind of end with. I'm doing a tasting in 2 weeks. It's all smoky whiskeys, and they're all really special smoky whiskeys. And the group that I do this for is, they love it. This is what they live for. So I love all whiskey. There's no whiskey I don't love. I do really appreciate these as well, but they're not for everybody, and they are an acquired taste, just like a lot of things are, right? I mean, we wouldn't be all here tonight if we didn't acquire a taste for whiskey, right? I mean, we all wanted to try different whiskeys. It's not like whiskey was our first thing that we ever had. So with that, I want to say cheers. I'm going to be here. We can ask questions and do whatever and drink whatever else is left in our little bottles. But I want to say thank you. I know it's been a little over 2 hours, but I've talked my butt off tonight. You guys haven't asked hardly any questions tonight, so I'm gonna need like a bunch of lozenges after this. I need to be out. the allergies are kicking up in gear here in the Northeast. We're starting to get everything all at once, and it's like, oh my God, I do my daily walks and I'm getting inundated with pollen. So I will need a bunch of or maybe more Lagavulin. I'll just need more Lagavulin tonight. But you know, it was fun. I hope you learned a lot and taste a lot. But please ask questions. You know, hang out. I've got nowhere to go. So again, thank you, and cheers to Thornhill. You know,
Thank you.
sounds
Go
like a
Thunderbirds.
great school.
Thank you, Charles.
Thank you, Charles.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
I hope I didn't bore you all with all that talk.
If I unfortunately need to leave, but if I have questions, could I email you a couple? A couple of.
Of course, yeah. I'll type my email in the chat here so you have it.
You've mentioned Lefroy a couple times, and I think I've had that once. Is that, and as I recall, that was kind of like the smokiest thing I'd ever tasted. Is that
actually
true?
it's not.
Okay.
It is one of the smokier expressions, and their general core line is some of the most smoky. That and Ardbeg. Ardbeg also is very smoky. But so peat is measured in ppm, which stands for parts per million. So when they're actually infusing that smoke into the grain, there's actually a measurement of how smoky that is. And there's a distillery on Isla, which happens to be one of my favorites. It's called Bruichladdich. They're one of the original people at Bruichladdich is the person who opened Waterford in Ireland, which I talked highly about. But Bruichladdich has, they have 3 lines. They have one that's called Bruichladdich, which is not peated, so there's no smoke at all, which is fantastic whiskey. Then they have a whiskey that's called Port Charlotte, which is pretty peaty. It's about, you know, Ardbeg level, so pretty peaty. But then their last line is called Octomore, and Octomore is the highest smoke content ppm whiskey that's out there. Octomore is fantastic. I went, actually the best whiskey tasting that I've ever been to in my life was on Isla at Bruichladdich, and it was an Octomore masterclass with their distiller, and it blew me away. I mean, I was just on another planet at that point. But it is, you know, so typically a ppm, an average ppm is around 40. That would be a pretty smoky whiskey. So Ardbeg, maybe some Lefroy's. Octomores can get up to like 200, you know, or even higher than 200. There's a couple that are higher than 200. Typically they're around 170 to 200, but yeah, that's like a whole nother level. Now, it's not like, since it's 4 times or 5 times as much as a 40 ppm, it doesn't make it 5 times as smoky, but it is smokier. It's just a level of peat. So Lefroy is, you know, for the most part, if people have had a bad experience with Scotch, it's probably because they've had a Lefroy 10 as their first ever Scotch or whiskey, and they've just like, oh, I can't do it, I'm done.
Yeah.
Or an Ardbeg 10, one of the two. Those two are pretty smoky and not representative of what Scotland has to offer. Maybe of what Isla has to offer, but not Scotland. And again, that's my whole point with this, is you got to think outside of the smoke. And there's a lot of incredible whiskey that is not peated as well, but some beautiful peated stuff too. So
the peat
Where would
change-
Compass Monster? Sorry.
Okay,
I
sorry.
was gonna ask, where does the peat monster come into that level?
yeah, so Peat Monster is a really great expression. So Peat Monster is up there in ppm. You know, they're a blend of different single malts that are all peated. So I believe they're in the 70 or 80 somewhere, so they're up there. You know, it's definitely a good peated expression. And we've done some Peat Monster with our club and stuff, and it's fun. I like what they're doing with that. But that's a blend. You know, that's not a single malt. But it's fun. You know, there's Compass Box is doing some great things with blends. So.
I love the Lefroy marketing in the you know, in the can where you get the little thing you can send away to be a owner of the distillery. I sent that away, like, I guess now that would be 22 years ago. I still have the little certificate. Is that part of their tour thing? Is that, did you
Yeah,
do
well,
that?
so you don't actually have to be on a tour. You can go into their visitor center there, and they have a kiosk, and you can type in your Lafroig membership number, and it will show you on a map where your little 1 square foot plot is, and you can take a flag from your country and go to that plot and stick your flag in the ground there. So it's definitely a clever, you know, way to keep the world informed of you know, what they're releasing, but at the same time tie you into you actually own a plot of land. I mean, it's a foot or a square foot, but you know, I went and did it. I mean, you got to do it. If you're there, you got to do it. You know, it's part of it. So it's fun.
Does the peating change the color on the whiskey?
No, it has nothing to do. Color comes from the wood. So depending on how long the whiskey is in the wood, the darker it will be. Or if it's a sherry barrel or a port pipe, especially, will provide a really dark, you know, influence on the color. Now, some Scottish distilleries do add coloring. You know, where we talked about bourbon at the beginning, there's no color or additives added to bourbon. But in Scotland, you can do that. You can add, actually, it's like a caramel coloring. You know, there's a debate whether or not it changes the flavor. You know, some people are believers that it doesn't, and then other people say it definitely does. And so there's this big debate. I don't know. I'm not that good enough to know if it really does change the flavor. It's hard to do a side by side with that, you know, because if a distillery is using color or caramel coloring, I mean, how do you know, you know, if that really is influencing their whiskey or not? You're not tasting their whiskey without it, so how can you compare it? You know, it's pretty hard. But like Dalmore, I don't know, some of you might have heard of Dalmore. There's one famous one called the cigar malt. They use caramel coloring. So the whole reason behind the coloring is that they want their bottles on the shelf to all look the same. They don't want somebody to go and say, oh, this bottle looks lighter or darker. But you know, that's the reason behind the coloring is, you know, they're worried about people saying, oh, this one hasn't aged enough. It's not dark enough. You know, it's so they keep that coloring to make it all look the same.
I was thinking what you said about how each, you know, thing that they craft is so dependent, like from that video, it's dependent on that particular barrel and all these other things. And then they kind of like take all of them and then remix them to get a nice blend that reflects. But how do they create that consistency of their brand if it's so variant on?
Well, that's a great question. So like Oban, for example, their 14-year, you know, they've been around in the US since 88. Now, does it taste the same as it was in 88 when they first released it here in the US? That's a good question. I don't know. It's not easy to find bottles from that long ago, but I'm sure it's changed over time. It's not like you can keep that exact same flavor consistency all the time. But when you're batching together a lot of barrels, you can get pretty close, you know. So it does change over time, and it does here in the US too. You know, I mean, we have that happen with bourbons too. You know, like Buffalo Trace, which is a famous distillery, they release every year their versions of some pretty exclusive bottles, and they're very hard to get. You know, they're expensive, but they change every year. And so every year you have these websites that come out and they rate them, you know, like, oh, 2019 was so much better than 2016 and 2020 was this and that. they're trying to be consistent. I mean, they're not trying to be different with those. However, they're releasing them at different years, and you do know what year they're released because the proof is different every year. They're not coming out with the same exact proof. So you do know, okay, 2017 was 122 proof. 2019 was 119 proof. So you know what year it is based on the proof, but the flavor is a little different. They're trying to be as consistent as possible, but it's hard. Now, when you're talking Scotland, it's a much bigger batch of barrels, you know, so that it's a little bit easier maybe to be consistent. But it's still, it's an art form. I mean, it definitely is an art form in a way.
They don't put the year on, like wine puts the year on, but you can find out the year if you know how to do your research.
But not like Oban, not like the Oban 14. You're not going to see a year on that.
You could, but they just don't want to get into that market.
No.
Vintages are different.
No, none of these. Lagavulin, the last three we did, they don't put years. Even Green Spot, none of these really. Any of the ones we had tonight, are they going to put the year? You know, they don't.
Yourself then going, I definitely prefer this year. I'm going to find the bottle that is the same. Like, do you kind of like the connoisseurs kind of know, like, I want to get this batch or something?
Well, with those special bottles, like I was just talking about from Buffalo Trace, you do. And I have a bunch of those in my safe or whatever you want to call it, my bunker. But, you know, they vary, you know, and people will pay more for those, you know, to get their hands on the better ones, you know, and that happens in Japan too. We didn't talk a lot about Japan, but a lot of that happens with Japan as well. Certain years, it's like wines in a way, you know, certain years are better than others, not because of terroir or because there was a frost or, you know, some of these other things, but just because of how they aged that year. It's all about the barrel at that point. But that's what makes whiskey fun. There's always new things. You know, when we talk about barrels, there are all these different types of wine barrels that are being used now for finishing whiskeys. And that just opens up the door to all these different flavors, you know, and ages too. You know, the longer you put it in this type of wine barrel or that type of wine barrel, you know, it just makes it's never ending in terms of new whiskeys to try. You know, wine is a huge world. Wine, you could never be like, oh, I want to try all the wines in the world. It's impossible. And it's impossible with whiskey too. There are that many whiskeys now that are coming out all the time that there's no way you can keep up. And that's what makes it fun. For somebody like me, that's what makes it fun. And the fact that new distilleries are opening up all the time, all over the world. You know, I just brought in a bunch of barrels from Tasmania that we're going to be bottling. You know, Australia and Tasmania is like the next incredible place. You know, Japan is impossible to get stuff from now. And that's what's going to happen with Australia and Tasmania too. And it's fun to be early adopters or, you know, able to get stuff from there now because we know, but it's not going to happen for too long before everybody gets on board, and it'll be too expensive. That's what happens. So
there was a question in the chat, but I think they've already dropped off about Japanese ones.
Oh no. Oh, okay.
No, I didn't see it until.
Oh yeah, Kayla.
Yeah, but
Well,
we'll follow up. We know them well enough. We can get the scoop from you.
Well, I mean, so Japanese whiskey, the basis behind Japanese whiskey is it's been around for about 100 years. There was a guy, Taketsuru, who went to Japan. He interned with a couple of different distilleries, learned everything that they did in Scotland, like was a really good student, learned as much as possible, went back to Japan, basically did what the Japanese do best, which is, you know, learn and imitate and do better, you know, whether it's whatever product it is, whether it's cars or stereos or, whatever, TVs. I mean, they do a great job learning, and maybe they're the first also to do these things, but they're very good at learning the best practices and making them even better. That's the strategy of the Japanese, and they're super good at it. So they did that with whiskey. And so they've been making whiskey a long time, and they're doing it the Scottish way. So it's 100% malted barley. The peat, if they are smoking whiskey, the peat is coming from Scotland. So again, they're trying to make it as close to Scotland as possible. I've been to Yoichi, which is up in, near Sapporo. It's peated whiskey. I've seen them putting the coals. They actually still use coal fired stills, so they're actually putting coals in there. It's all peat from Scotland, but basically they're making some great whiskey. It's all being purchased and kept by mostly the Japanese or the Chinese. The Chinese are coming over and buying it all in droves, and the good stuff barely gets to the United States. It's that hard to get. Now we do get some good good. The basic stuff you see in the stores is pretty bad, and it's not representative of what Japanese whiskey is, which is unfortunate. Occasionally you'll see a Yamazaki 12-year or Hakushu 12-year and some of these others. They're good, but they're not really the good stuff. The good stuff, when it does get here, it's gobbled up so quickly that you can't even blink an eye, and it's super expensive. It's ridiculously expensive. So it's so hard for me to describe what it's like. You have to go to Japan to see what it's like. I mean, seriously, that's the only way to understand Japanese whiskey, is by actually going to Japan and doing, a whiskey experience, because we just don't get it here. It's really good though. I mean, and it's not old. That's the other thing. So, we think about Scotch, and this is the other transition that's happening in the world. Age doesn't matter that much anymore. Whether it's American whiskey or Irish whiskey or Scottish whiskey, if it's 10 years, 10 years used to be the minimum for Scottish whiskey before anybody would even taste it. It's a 10-year. That's like the baseline, age. That's not the case anymore. I just had, a year and a half ago or so, a 3-year Scottish whiskey, which was one of the best whiskeys I've ever had out of Scotland. So age doesn't mean anything anymore. And Japan is really pushing the envelope with that. There's a distillery there called Chichibu. Chichibu is one of my favorite distilleries on the planet, and very, very, very difficult to get bottles of Chichibu. But most of their whiskey is very young. I mean, I'm talking 3 to 6, 7, 8 years, in that range. And this is Scotch. This is Scotch made, so it's not bourbon. It's not corn. So it's not aged in Kentucky where it ages faster because it's hotter and all that. Japan's still a colder climate. Chichibu, they're coming out with 3, 4, 5-year-old whiskeys that are outstanding. Some of the best whiskeys I've ever had. So age doesn't really matter. If somebody says, "Oh, I won't drink that because it's not old enough," that's bogus. That's ridiculous. They just don't understand the whiskey world if they're saying stuff like that. Now the core line expressions from most big distilleries will still say 10 years, 12 years, 15 years. Those are the baseline dates, but that's not necessarily what's in their warehouse at 3 or 4 or 5 years or 6 years. That could be fantastic, yet they're too afraid to put it out because it's young. And they're worried that their customers are going to be like, "Oh, it's only a 6-year whiskey. I'm not going to drink that. It's too young." So that's slowly changing. Japan is leading the pack with that. Japan is making Scotland change because their whiskey is so good. Also, Australia is going to be part of that mix too, because their young whiskeys are really good. They use a lot of wine barrels in Australia, which is really awesome. You know, there's such great wine in Australia, Shiraz, and you know, you name it. There's some wonderful wine in Australia. Well, they use those barrels for their whiskey. You know, so they're on top of it. And we just did a tasting a week ago with a company called Starward, and that's one to write down. Starward only uses wine barrels to age their whiskey, and it's fantastic. And we just picked a barrel with them a couple months ago for the club. It's our own barrel. We bought 240 bottles. It's coming in the beginning of June, but it's unbelievable. I'm so excited to have our hands on it because it's so tasty. But it's all wine barrels, so they use a little bit of French oak too. So there is some wood that's coming from France, but most of it's American oak that's been used for wine in Australia, or French oak that's been used for wine in Australia, and it's a combination of those two oaks that they're aging their whiskey in. But really fantastic. So that's a distillery to look for. You can find a couple of their expressions in the US right now, and they're reasonable and they're very good. Nova is one of them, so Starward Nova. And then they have another one called Starward Twofold, TWO fold. Both of those are very good. So age is not that important anymore. At least it won't be. So.
Cool. Thank you, Charles. Thanks,
you.
Noah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed tonight.
Yeah,
It's
it's
great. It's really
fantastic.
fun.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you so
you.
much.
Take care.
All right. Have a good night, everybody.
All
Good
right.
night. Thank
Hey,
you.
Thank